So I want to have a little bit of a conversation about this idea of rationality in foreign policy. And this is going to lay a foundation for a lot of what we're going to be talking about over the course of the semester as we wrestle with why do states do what they do. But it's also useful for thinking about the policy evaluation project and how that relates to this idea of good decision-making or better decision-making in foreign policy. So I want to make a differentiation between this idea of instrumental rationality and procedural rationality. And both are used to describe what states do, but they have very different implications for what we expect from states. So when we think about instrumental rationality, this is what economists or game theorists will work with when they say that human beings are rational. They're talking about individuals considering all possible options, ranking those options in terms of expected utility. So expected, what do you think is going to happen? And utility is the value that that option or that outcome would give to you personally. So we as individuals have different preferences, and so we may rank things differently. Rationality doesn't mean that we all see things the same way. It means that we rank things according to how they benefit us personally and our preferences. And then we as rational or instrumentally rational actors would select the option or the outcome that would maximize our personal utility. So given our preferences, given the options, which one is best for us? So that's one way of thinking about rationality. And we do use that framework when thinking about states, but I think in this class, when we talk about rationality, and particularly when we're doing the policy evaluations, what we're really interested in is this idea of procedural rationality, which is we're going through a process that's trying to systematically choose a good policy option. So we're going to consider different possibilities. We're going to consider different options. We're maybe going to have a conversation about the pros and the cons. We're going to look at evidence to try to evaluate those pros and cons and the risks and all sorts of different things. And through a discussion and a dialogue and a back and forth, we're going to arrive at some sort of agreement about what should be done, what choices is a good choice. And then that's going to be communicated out and coordinated with all the relevant actors that are going to be involved in that process. So we're making much less of a claim about a perfect process. There's no discussion that we're going to get all the possible options. There's no guarantee that we've evaluated things perfectly in terms of expected utility. And so we're debating pros and cons. We're evaluating evidence. And we're not making a claim that we've chosen the best outcome possible. What we're saying is that there's a process to try to identify better possible solutions rather than worse. So procedural rationality makes fewer claims about maybe perfect decision-making that we might get with instrumental rationality. I think it's also worth thinking about human decision-making in terms of three different, I guess, models. So with instrumental rationality, we're oftentimes assuming that people are engaged in a process of optimizing, that they're looking at the options and they're trying to find the best possible option that's going to benefit them the most, right? So there's that claim of best. But a lot of human decision-making doesn't work like that. A lot of human decision-making is much more satisficing, where we don't spend a lot of time evaluating options and considering possibilities and studying. Instead, we just sort of need to make a quick decision and we select the first workable decision that we can possibly come across, right? So when I'm looking for a gas station, I don't pull up my GPS and look at all the gas stations in Grand Forks where I live and look at the prices and consider all the different variables. Instead, I typically just go to the first one that I see that's reasonably convenient. I'm satisficing. We could also think about human decision-making as sort of a mix of almost satisficing kind of impulses and optimizing. And there's this idea that's been floated by folks like Alex Mintz of polyheuristic decision-making. And so the idea is that human decision-making involves a series of shortcuts to whittle down complexity. And then within sort of a narrower range of options, we can engage in sort of the pro and con discussion of possibilities and evaluation. And so one way I would maybe sort of illustrate this is if you were having a conversation with a roommate about, what you should order out, it might go something like this. Do you want pizza? Nah, no. Do you want tacos? Nah, no. Burgers? Maybe. Okay, let's have a conversation now about Five Guys burgers versus McDonald's versus one of the gastro pubs in town, and where we want to get food from that list, right? So essentially we're using shortcuts. We're using these criteria and saying, I'm not going to consider that, I'm not going to consider that, I'm not going to consider that, but I am going to consider this range, this small subset. And within that, we can have the more detailed discussion about what's the best option. Now, we might be missing that there's a really great, amazing restaurant out there that would service the best possible food, but because it's classified as a pizza place, we missed it because we dismissed pizza places outright in our quest for what do we eat tonight. So that would be polyheuristic decision making, where we sort of mix these satisficing, I'm not going to consider that, I'm not going to consider that, I'm just looking here kind of decision processes with a more rational, systematic, procedural, or even instrumental rationality. Couple more things I want to flag quickly when we talk about decision-making in states and this idea of rationality. Oftentimes with rationality, there's an assumption, particularly with instrumental rationality, that we're talking about a unitary actor. What that means is that there's a single mind, right, that's doing the evaluation, that's ranking, that has preference ordering, and that single mind controls a single body that can carry out the actions that are desired by that mind, right? And so when we talk about this idea of instrumental rationality, it's sort of implied that we have our own preferences and we act accordingly. But when we look at states and we try to think about foreign policy, that idea of a single mind carrying out a decision doesn't work quite as well. We still oftentimes will talk about the United States chose this or the United States did this in the way that we would as if we were talking about a person. But in reality, states are much more complex. There's many different power centers. There's Congress and the presidency, and maybe state actors and the bureaucracies, and they may have different preferences. They may have different things that they want, right? And so they may be pulling in different directions, and they may not always be working in perfect concert, right? They might be working toward different goals. And so I think one of my favorite examples of this, early in the Obama administration, I think the Secretary of Defense or one of the generals that was leading operations in Afghanistan, commented that the CIA's drone program of blowing the heck out of terrorist organizations in Afghanistan was undercutting the U.S. ability to conduct counterinsurgency operations in Afghanistan to win the Afghan sort of conflict and defeat the Taliban. And the response of the director of the CIA was quite blunt. It was, the CIA is not doing counterinsurgency. The CIA is doing counterterrorism. That's why we're doing this. Well, the United States is doing counterinsurgency. The United States is doing counterterrorism, and these things are working at cross purposes. That sort of thing wouldn't be happening with a unitary actor where you would know your mind, but it's something that happens all the time with states as complex actors with many different organizations working in theory together, but not always. The other thing I need to flag, and this is going to be relevant when we do our policy evaluations, is that policy evaluation is both a theoretical and a moral activity. That in order to be able to sort of make claims about the expected utility of different policies, to evaluate how good of a job that they're doing or what are the costs or the benefits, we have to go through a process of counterfactual reasoning. If I do this, what is likely to happen? We're essentially making a prediction about the future based on our actions. And that's really tough. I mean, we as human beings are not omniscient. We are not clairvoyant. And the theories that we have to understand the social world are oftentimes probabilistic. This usually works. Sometimes they're poorly specified. It usually works, but it might not work in this situation. And oftentimes they're overly simplistic. We don't really dig into the details of situations. And so I think it's worth maybe keeping in the back of our minds that we're always doing sort of a theoretical project when we're doing policy evaluation, because we're trying to imagine how would the world be different if we chose a particular option. Policy evaluation is also a moral activity. What I mean by that is that in order to say this policy is better than that policy, we have to have sort of a sense of what is it that's good? What is it that we're trying to do? There's a normative claim about this is what we want. And if we don't have that normative claim, right, if we don't know what are our goals, what are our objectives, what are the things that we're trying to achieve, then there's really no point in engaging in policy evaluation at all, because without those goals, it's impossible to say one policy is better than another, because better only makes sense in the context of goals. And if we change our goals, policy evaluation changes completely. Part of the idea of grand strategy is to create sort of a broad agreement across the US foreign policy apparatus about what those goals are. What are the things that the United States is trying to work toward? And so once you have that as a foundation, then you can go and say, given that these are our goals, these are the policies that would help to achieve those effectively.